It's Wednesday night. You know what that means. It's the Retro Chat podcast. Hello, everyone. Welcome to this week's show. My name's Andy Evans, and I'm going to be taking you through some Retro Chat goodness with a difference, because tonight we're going to be welcoming a very special guest, and that guest is none other than a gentleman called Jack Olesker. Now, the name may not sound familiar. It may sound familiar. Let's see if you know, because Jack is a writer, creative consultant, a producer of some of the most iconic 80s and 90s and the noughties kids shows of all time. So looking down at some of his accolades, he's done the Care Bears for Deke, Heathcliff in the Cadillac Cats, also for Deke, M.A.S.K, Mobile Armored Strike Command from 1986 to 1987. He was the executive producer, the co-creator. He wrote the series Bible and 37 episodes of The New Adventures of He-Man. He was also the man responsible for bringing the Power Rangers to the UK and to the global, to the world, in the format that we know. In this interview coming up, we are going to be talking all about how he started out, the beginnings of his career, how he met Haim Saban, how he got involved with Deke, his time writing for M.A.S.K and for Heathcliff. We're obviously going to be spending some time on the New Adventures, and we're also going to be talking about the Mighty Morphin Power Rangers. It's a great little interview. We hope you enjoy it. I want to personally thank Jack for his time and being so open and honest with me. Right, next week we'll be back with more of the Retro Chat podcast. Stay tuned to social media across all of the MOS Network to find out what we are going to be doing. Now, if you would like to get in contact with us here at the Retro Chat podcast, you can do it by various different means. You can follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitch by searching for Retro Chat podcast. You can also follow us on Twitter and join the conversation using the hashtag #BackInTime. If you are listening on the audio podcast and want to watch the video version, why not? We are the channel to go old school. Go to YouTube and search for the Retro Chat Podcast UK. If you are watching us on YouTube and you want to listen to the audio version only, and again, why not? It's great for a drive or a commute. You can go to all good podcast providers from Spotify, Apple, Amazon, Google, Pandora, you name it, and search for the Retro Chat podcast. Now, we have got other shows on the network, and that includes the Ministry of Slam, and they are live every Sunday from 7 o'clock GMT on all of the same platform that we are on. And you can also interact with them on Facebook, Twitch, YouTube, Instagram, and Twitter at the MOS Network. So let's do it. Let's move to the interview with Jack Olesker. I hope you enjoy it, guys. It was an absolute privilege to sit down with him. And while you're there, check out heman.org and interact with Jack on the New Adventures board within the vintage category. Let's go to a quick break now. When we come back, it's Jack Olesker. I will see you next week. But until then, take care. See you soon.
Join the MOS Network,
the home of the Ministry of Slam Pro Wrestling show every Sunday at 7 p.m. UK time. We bring you all the latest wrestling news, fun segments, and of course we bring you classic wrestling interviews from the last 20 years.
The only people that really have taken shots at us are the people that are really avid WWE fans.
We are also the home of the Retro Chat podcast. Go back in time with Andy Evans every single Wednesday at 7 p.m. UK.
And don't forget the Ministry of Horror show with Tez every single Tuesday, where he looks back, brings in special guests, and looks at the history of horror.
The MOS Network is an awesome community for wrestling fans, pop culture fans, and people who like positive energy all around the world.
Come and make friends with like-minded fans 24/7 in our exclusive Discord community.
Gaming and music streams. Come on.
Yeah, we won. Yeah.
And for you audio listeners, we also have the Ministry of Slam on the podcast feeds.
Check it out on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and anywhere you check out your audio podcasts.
Ladies and gentlemen, wrestling wins with the MOS Network.
Welcome back to the Retro Chat podcast. Andy here, and joining me right now is my guest at this time. He is one of the most renowned writers, producers, directors of any genre, from kids' cartoons through to movies, through to novels. It's Jack Olesker. Jack, welcome to the show. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. You make me blush with that intro. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure.
10 years of doing podcasts, Jack. 10 years of doing podcasts. Now, as we said, you have really had a storied career. Tell us a bit about how you got involved in the industry. What started it all off?
Well, I've been very blessed to be in the entertainment industry for, my gosh, going on 40 years now. And I grew up in Chicago. I worked in my parents' clothing stores, which I did not like at all, and was a writer, from, early childhood. And in 1976, I wrote a novel called No Place Like Home about a killer who was living in a high-rise building in Chicago. He was actually a baseball player, and his wife was a nasty person. His kids were strung out on various drugs. And he decided he was going to take their lives. He couldn't keep up with his young teammates anymore, and then, kill himself. And when it came time to do it, he had a kind of approach avoidance thing. He couldn't bring himself to do it. And instead, he killed people who lived in the building to take the place of his wife and family, a long way from the Care Bears. I knew so little, about publishing. I was 25 years old at the time, that I sent my only copy of the novel into G.P. Putnam's Sons in New York in a shirt box. And had I known that at the time that Putnam's received 5,000 or 6,000 unsolicited manuscripts a month, I probably never would have even sent it in. But I was fortunate to have a second reader who plucked it out of the slush pile, moved it up the ladder, and I had a wonderful editor named Marcia McGill, who, along with Putnam's, bought the publication rights. And the novel ended up becoming a bestseller, came to the attention of Bill Castle, who did all those wonderful B horror films in the 50s and 60s, House on Haunted Hill, The Tingler, Dr. Sardonicus, 13 Ghosts. And Bill, along with a wonderful lady named Sherry Lansing, who was working at MGM at the time, bought the film rights to my novel. Sherry went on to become the longest-serving CEO and president of a motion picture studio in history, Paramount Motion Pictures, where she did films like Titanic, The Accused, Fatal Attraction, and many others. And they bought the film rights from me, and actually for $50,000, which, back in 1976, that was a considerable sum of money. So I loaded up my little TR-7 and hopped in it and rode cross country to Los Angeles, where I was convinced I had golden fingers and I was going to become the next great screenwriter. And unfortunately, what I didn't realize was that there were 5,237 people a day that were moving to Los Angeles with the same idea.
Wow.
So I was putting food on the table by serving as a editor at a magazine called Entrepreneur Magazine. And I was fortunate that the building that I lived in Studio City in Los Angeles, it was kind of an entertainment business building. We had Bob Eubanks, who did the Dating Game, lived there, a couple of soap opera stars. And there was this gentleman named Jean Chalopin, who was French, and he owned a small production company, animation studio in Studio City, and he knew that I was a writer, and I think he liked the idea that I wrote novels. I had 2 or 3 more novels published by then, and could tell a good story. And you have to realize that back in those days, in the late 70s and the early 80s, there was really not such, with the exception of things like the Jeffersons or the Flintstones, there really weren't animated stories or series that told a full-blown story. you mostly had animators who would write a couple of lines of dialogue, and that was it. And Jean, who was a visionary, wanted to do stories that had real stories to them. And he offered me the opportunity to get involved in children's television. I wasn't quite sure if I wanted to do that. And then I woke up at 3 o'clock in the morning. I thought, what am I thinking? Let me grab this. So he had me do a number of teleplays, and I knew nothing about writing for television, but he really mentored me on a television series called The Littles, and that aired on ABC. And Jean lived down the hall from me. I would write. I'm a night person. I have trouble blinking before 10 or 11 o'clock in the morning. And I would write until 3 o'clock in the morning. I would shove the script underneath the door of his condo. He'd edit it and then shove it back under my door at 9 o'clock in the morning, and I'd start doing rewrites. And I wrote 3 or 4 episodes, and there was a wonderful woman at the studio named Judy Price, who was the vice president of children's television. And she kind of took a shine to me. And Jean decided he was going to offer me a position on staff. So I went on to this new animation studio. My first staff job was a story editor for the Care Bears that we were doing at Deke. And that led to a long career with Deke before I broke out and went on my own.
I mean, looking at your CV and looking at what you've done at Deke, I mean, I'm looking at it now on your website. M.A.S.K, Heathcliff and the Cadillac Cats, the Care Bears, the Get Along Gang. I remember growing up watching these back in the 80s, especially M.A.S.K. I mean, M.A.S.K was just absolutely tremendous.
Wonderful show.
What does it feel like realizing that you're part of a childhood institution, that you've literally written things that I've watched, and now I'm sitting down with my child watching them with her? I mean, that must be mind-blowing, right?
It was, and it is. I walked into Office Max a couple weeks ago to get some scripts copied, and the fella behind the counter is a young man about your age. He said, "Oh, Mr. Olesker, I read this article about you in the newspaper, and you did He-Man." I said, "Yeah, did you like that?" He says, "No, but my dad used to watch it." "Oh, nice." I said, "Well, I'm still very active in the industry." But, it was an amazing time. In a certain sense, in a real sense, it was the golden age of television animation. Obviously there was a golden age of film, with Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs and, so many wonderful iconic films. But for television, this, and Jean Chalopin, I really have to give him props. He was really a visionary in creating animation that told these full stories. And when I later did The New Adventures of He-Man, that was one of the first animated shows that was serialized, that had a continuing storyline from episode to episode. So I think I just happened to, obviously, I've been so blessed that the Lord gave me talent, but you have to work at it. There was a time before Tiger Woods ever picked up a golf club. There was a time before LeBron ever, shot his first basket. You have to work at it. You have to, hit those 500 or 1,000 golf balls a day and shoot, 200 or 300 free throws every single day. So I worked very hard at it. I was fortunate to grow up in the clothing business and working for my parents. So I developed a mercantile sense. And I realized that while what I was creating was art, it was also product, and it had an end user, the viewers. But I was so very fortunate to be moving into this career field at a time that there was this tectonic change to storytelling, which dovetailed by happenstance, although I do say there are never any accidents, it dovetailed by happenstance with my storytelling ability. So I was the right person at the right time. So for that, it was a joy. And, the more that they would throw at me, the more the more I would devour it. Jean used to have a nickname for me in French. He'd say, "You are l'animal." You're the animal. You write. Noel Coward, the playwright, once said, "Work is much more fun than fun," and I agree with that. So that's how I feel about the origins of my career.
So when you were working on a series, was it common for you to be working on multiple ones at the time? So if we take Heathcliff, for example, and M.A.S.K, were you working on both shows at the same time?
There are different writers that have different modes of operation. With me, I'm like an amoeba. The more you throw at me, the more I'm going to digest it. So I would frequently be working on multiple series at the same time. There were other writers who were also wonderful writers that would prefer to just focus on one particular series. So the answer to your question is, yeah, I would be working on, not only would I be working on multiple series, but I would sometimes be working on a series that was in production and we were writing episodes. And at other times, I would be concurrently working on development of a new series, creating what we call a series Bible, which I'm sure many of your listeners and viewers know what that is, creating the whole world that a series is involved with, something that I absolutely love doing. Some of my series Bibles are 100 and 120 pages. So I would do both of those things at the same time. And for me, the work is always a joy.
I mean, I interviewed Larry Kenny a few months ago, of course, the great voice actor of Lion-O and various different characters from Rankin Bass. And he said something very similar about when you're voice acting, you can either do the one character, then the next scene, and then you do the next thing. But with him, he always used to try and do all of the characters at the one time and would instantly change voices. And it's the same, I suppose, you get you into the frame of mind, right? You just kind of, you're in it, then you're going to move to another thing, and then you're going to do another thing, and you keep those characters fresh.
It takes a certain sort of mentality, and I don't mean that to be denigrating to anybody else. I don't mean to make it a superlative for me, but it takes a certain kind of personality to be able to switch to those different things. And I am convinced that the reason that I'm able to do that is that prior to my writing for television and film, I wrote novels. Okay, I've had 7 novels published. And when you're writing a novel, by nature of the beast, you have to be able to shift characters multiple times within an entire chapter, sometimes within a paragraph. So being able to do that, to move to different POVs, was something that I learned very on in writing for novels. Now, there are certainly people who have only worked in television that have that ability. One that comes to mind was a gentleman that I was blessed to work with, as well as working for his son, who was Mel Blanc, who did so many of the voices for Looney Tunes. And Mel could shift from Porky Pig to Bugs Bunny to Pepe Le Pew instantly, okay, and make a seamless change. And that was a gift that he had.
Absolutely. I mean, you mentioned earlier on the gift of being able to write and writer's Bibles. You touched on that earlier on. And I think one of the biggest things that we know you for over here, or we've recently covered on this show, is the new adventures of He-Man. What a task that must have been to have taken an iconic character who only a couple of years earlier was still on TV with Filmation, and redevelop it, redesign it. What was the process like for you? And how do you also feel about the reaction it's got since it aired? Because a lot of it's unfair.
Yeah. Not only was it a challenge because the previous show was on the air, not so far back from the time that I started on it for Mattel, but you also need to understand the backstory. Jean Chalopin had left Deke, Andy Hayward, another one of my great mentors, along with my dear friend Haim Saban, who taught me so much about the business of my entertainment industry. But Jean had left to start a new company called Jetlag, and he took with him a great guy named Mark Taylor, not to be confused with Mark Taylor, the artist, by the way. But Mark was his chief financial officer at Jetlag, and at Deke, and Jean took him with him when he started this new company called Jetlag. And I'm living, I think I was living in Canoga Park one day, and I get this phone call from Mark, and I'm sitting in a hot tub, and he says, Jack, he says, Mattel wants to reboot He-Man, and they want you to do something called The New Adventures of He-Man. We're going to take him away from Eternia. We're going to move him way out into outer space, and he's going to help this other planet. So I said, okay, that sounds great, Mark. And Mark and I had worked many, many years at Deke Entertainment. And he said, the only catch is you have to write the series Bible within 2 weeks. Wow. And we're going to start out with a 5-part episode, and you need to write that within a month. So I said, well, that's quite a challenge. I said, tell me about the 5-part episode. He said, it's going to be serialized. It will be going from episode to episode. We're going to string those 5 episodes together. We're going to do a bridge between them, and we're going to premiere it as a movie at MGM's theater in Culver City. So I said, hey, this sounds fabulous. So I leapt into it, went out to Mattel. And I have to say, I know that Mattel takes some heat sometimes, but as a writer, they treated me with so much respect and courtesy and generous with their time, never dictating to me what needed to be done. Although they're a toy manufacturer, I understand their business was selling toys, but people like Deborah Galliani, Karen Lee Brown, Cassandra Schofhausen, who were executives at Mattel, they got the fact that a show would only be successful, and in their eyes, success was determined by selling toys, if it had entertainment value. So they turned me loose. They showed me all the prototypes of the line, and they said, Jack, go ahead and do what you want to do. And I said, what if I want to develop some independent characters of my own? They said, you're free to do that. So I did that. And I knocked out the series Bible, 96 pages, and the pilot episodes, 5 of them. And I did that in the time that was necessary. And then Mark put it over to Mattel, and he came back a week later. He says, look, they're crazy about it. He says, we've got to buy for 65 episodes, and I want you to jam on it. And what I ended up doing was writing the storylines, and then the beat outlines, and then the full scripts, and doing all the revisions. I wrote 34 episodes in a space of 19 weeks. And it was kind of like, in my Air Force career, I was a helicopter search and rescue medic. They used to lower me out of the hoist to pick up downed pilots who were injured. And I went through survival training in the Air Force. And writing all those episodes and writing that series Bible in a space of 20 weeks, it was kind of like survival training. It's something that I'm glad I went through, but I sure would not want to go through it again. So to answer the second part of your question, and this has been proposed to me many times on He-Man.org, I have to plug the wonderful He-Man.org because it's such a great site. But it's been proposed to me before. Oh, Jack, how did you feel about the reaction to it? It was so negative, and they were ready to tar and feather you and ride you out of a rail out of town. And I always say you gotta realize that the state of the art was very different back then. You didn't have the web. You didn't have Snapchat. You didn't have Facebook. There was no web. Okay, so in defense of Mattel, they didn't have an opportunity to make it known to the fan base that this was a different adventure for He-Man. He was going to go to this planet, but ultimately he would come back to Eternia after his job on Primus was done. And some fans said, well, would he really leave his family and his loved ones to go to this other planet? And, my answer is that our brave and courageous servicemen and women in the US, in the UK, and many countries in the world, this is what they do. They leave their family. They leave their friends to defend freedom and liberty. So I think He-Man's going to Primus was a very He-Man kind of a thing for him to do. So that was my thoughts. Listen, it was a hole in my heart that we didn't get to do season 2. We did 65 episodes. And in reality, a Saturday morning show is 13 episodes. So we basically had 5 years worth of the show. But I would have loved to have done season 2 and had He-Man come back to Eternia and find that in his absence that Marlena and her husband had fallen, that Man-at-Arms had taken over, and that, the sorceress and Tila and She-Ra tried to rule, but they were exiled, and He-Man comes back and said, what happened when I was gone? And now he's got another adventure. I would like to have had him come back with Skeletor and with some of the characters from New Adventures, Flog, who I always loved, Slushhead, oh my God, and bring back Mara and Critta, oh my Critta, my beating heart be still, and Trisky and a couple others, and bring them in with our other characters. But unfortunately, it wasn't meant to be.
I mean, it's such a shame because, hearing what you would have done in season 2 as a He-Man fan is something that is, you kind of sat there going, I really want to see this happen. Now, I know we've had the 2000X reboot series and we had Revelations this past couple of years, but to see that would have just been amazing. Now, I remember watching the New Adventures. I was 8, I think, when that series first aired. So obviously I knew He-Man, I knew the Filmation, the classic series.
Right.
But I remember watching it going, oh, this is different. Because it was really bright, it was really shiny, it was really different. And in fair play to Jetlag and to Jean Chalopin, the animation style that they brought in, this Japanese anime style, really fit and made it different. It seemed so much more ahead of its time than what it was. And part of that's down to your writing as well.
Absolutely. It was absolutely wonderful.
So you mentioned there about the first episode being a 5-part movie. And that was being streamed at MGM. What was the streaming reaction like when I would imagine it was an auditorium full of kids?
Well, they had a premiere at MGM Theater in Culver City, and Mark wanted me to come to it. So I didn't know what I was getting into. I walk into the MGM Theater. There's 1,500 kids, and they're popcorn and jujubes at each other. And on the stage, before they ran the film, we've got a live action He-Man and Skeletor that are clanging swords on the stage, and the kids are loving it, And then they ran these 5 episodes as a film, as a 2.5-hour film. And the kids are screaming, they're cheering so much. And the reaction was unbelievable. But you got to remember that these were 6 and 7 and 8-year-old kids who had never seen He-Man before. And now, all of a sudden, here were these incredible characters. So unlike the adults who were maybe 20 at the time, who were familiar with the original He-Man, which was a wonderful show, they weren't shadowed by that. So the reception was spectacular. But unfortunately, the web didn't exist, and it got a lot of bad press.
Do you think if the show had been called something different and not had the He-Man moniker on it, same stories, same setup, gone from one planet to Primus, dealt with the arch enemy, with the mutants, the Guardians of the Galaxy, the Galactic Guardians, sorry. Do you think it would have got a better reception because it didn't have the name He-Man in it?
Yeah, absolutely, I do. I think it would stand alone. But in fairness to Mattel, you need to remember that you're talking about a franchise that generated over $500 million in sales revenues. So what happened was one day there was some executive at Mattel that was sitting in his office, and he said, I'm looking at the charts, the time and motion studies, and the sales are going down, which was natural because how many He-Man action figures can you get? How many Skeletor action? How many Man of War, Battle Cat figures can you get? At some point, you've got all that you can get. So what they decided was they wanted to create all of these new characters on another planet and hopefully get the same kind of reaction. But I think a big part of the problem was that the existing fan base didn't have the passion for the new show because they didn't understand it, which I certainly empathize with. And the younger viewers, it was one show in the midst of a ton of shows that were going on television. In those days, ABC, CBS, NBC, they were having huge blocks of animation on the weekends, so it was a highly competitive field. Unfortunately, at least in the beginning, that's what my friend Haim Saban found out when he tried to sell this new show that I created for him with these characters who are wearing. The heroes are wearing these helmets and the villains are in these ridiculous looking rubber costumes. So that was a hard slog for Haim in the beginning as well.
Well, that is a really nice segue because that brings us on to, I think, one of the most iconic shows.
No, really?
USA. I've never heard of it before. I think it's called the Power Rangers.
You see what I did there?
I think you can tell you're an expert at this, Jack. You really can. Mighty Morphin Power Rangers, such a shift in style from animation to live action using the Japanese footage. You co-created that. What? Wow. Did you?
You have to realize that there were changes that were coming about. There was kind of like a perfect storm. The cost of animation was going up. In the beginning, when we were doing Inspector Gadget, I think the licensing fee that we got from the broadcaster was about $175,000 an episode. Well, the animation costs were low, and you could make a buck just by doing the domestic U.S. animated series. So what happened was the animation costs started going up. And at the same time, you had all of these cable broadcasters coming out. You got to remember that in the late 70s, there was no cable, okay? Not to speak of, there was no CNN, there was no Home Shopping Network, there was no Cartoon Network, there was no Nickelodeon, there was no Macrame Network, whatever it was. All of a sudden, these different platforms started getting created. All of a sudden there was HBO, there was CNN, there was all of these different things. And as the children's shows, as the thematic children's networks started happening, the broadcast audience got splintered, okay, because there were so many different choices for them, which is a good thing for writers because you have more, places to deliver your work to. But the ratings went down, the advertising rates went down, and the animation costs went up. And Haim Saban, you're talking about one of the most amazing businessmen in any industry that's ever lived. Okay, I learned so much by osmosis by being around him. He saw this coming, and he said, "You know what? Animation costs are getting expensive." He says, "Let's do a live action show." And he was in his hotel in Japan in the late 70s, and he's watching this show on television. And I had broken away from Deke and started my own production company, 24/7 Productions. I was living down in Palm Springs, and Haim started his own animation studio. And like I said, he found out the cost of animation were going up so high, and he calls me up one day and he said, "Look, Jack," and Haim used to come in and do the music for all the Deke shows. Okay, and he calls me up one day and he said, Spielberg and Lucas and Geffen have found out you can make money in children's television. He said, there's not that many broadcast slots. He said, it's so competitive. He said, I can't take it anymore. I'm going to go bankrupt. I'm going to go back to Israel. I've got a couple of falafel stands. So I said, take it easy, Haim. I said, you and Cheryl come down to my place in Palm Springs. So we came down for the weekend. We were floating in our pool and he's groaning about everything. And 3 weeks later, he calls me up and he says, look, I got something I want you to see. I want you to come into LA. So I drive into his studio in Burbank. And Eleanor Levy Sarnoff was one of his executives. And she said, Haim wants you to look at this show. She says, it's all in Japanese. He doesn't want you to know what the old show was about. He wants you to create an entirely new show. And all he has to do is hire voiceover artists and do the voice recordings and dub it. He said he'll have 35 episodes. He bought 35 episodes. So I thought, what a brilliant idea. Woody Allen did something similar with a film called What's Up, Tiger Lily? So I said, let me see it. She shoves in the video cassette, no DVDs back then. I start watching, and it's Power Rangers. And it's all in Japanese. And my jaw hangs open. And I remember this like it was yesterday. She looks at me and she says, what's the matter, Jack? Don't you like it? I said, don't I like it? I said, you've got martial arts. I said, you've got aliens. I said, you've got dinosaurs and a witch. I said, this is going to be the longest running show on children's television. I thought I was inflating Haim's ego a little. Little did I know how right I was. So I set to work and I created that show. And then, of course, years later, I go to the NIP conventions in Cannes, France, twice a year. We sell international rights to shows that we're developing. And by now, Haim had the show everywhere. The Power Rangers are on the floor of the U.S. Senate and everything. And it was so successful. And he had a booth. It was like the size of my home. And he's selling all these different shows. And I had my son Alex with me and my wife Kim at the time. And Alex was a baby. And Haim just loves children. And he says, let me see this baby. And he's rocking the baby, hands it back to Kim. And Haim's a big guy. So he throws his arms around me in a bear hug. And I go like this. He says, what's the matter, Jack? I said, I want to look in my wallet to see if you and Rupert Murdoch put anything in there for all the money I made you guys on Power Rangers. He said, yeah, but you did okay on that show. I said, you're right. I said, it opened a lot of doors. And I'm eternally grateful to him. So that's the story about how I created Power Rangers for my good friend Haim Saban.
Wow. It's incredible when you again, I go back to what I said earlier on. When you watch these shows, you don't realize who's actually created them. And that's the fascinating thing about doing the show, is speaking to guys like yourself and getting the backstory on it. I remember watching Power Rangers in secondary school when it first came on, thinking, this is awesome. This is just, like you said, it was martial arts and everything else.
But, the key, lots of producers had seen it in Japan, but the key is that he got it. He was a visionary. He understood it. And when I saw him years later in Cannes, I said, Haim, I'm so happy for your success. He said, that's nice. He says, a lot of people tell me that. He says, but if the show had been a failure, they would have said, that idiot Saban, he spent $350,000 for this piece of garbage, So, license plate, I never forgot when he came down to Palm Springs. The license plate on his car says R.S.K. TKR, which is risk taker. And I think that's one of the reasons that Haim and I have always had a close relationship, because I am a risk taker. I left a cushy job in my parents' business. I'm 25 years old, driving around Chicago in a Mercedes. And I ended up selling the Mercedes and going out to LA in a TR7, and I didn't know anybody. And you got to be able to take the leap. Fate favors the bold.
Yeah.
And you have to be able to take that leap, and people say, well, how long did it take you, Jack? I said, it's not a question of how long. Wayne Gretzky, the hockey great, once said, you miss 100% of the shots you don't take. So you got to be willing to take those shots.
How would you define your legacy? I mean, I know that's a question to ask, but how would you define it?
As I said, I've been so blessed to work with children all of my life. And children are these amazing creatures. If you shut up and listen to them, you're going to learn a lot. When all of my children were in preschool and first grade, I would go into their school every week. I'd do Mr. Olesker's Bookie and a Cookie Club. I'd bring in cookies for all the kids in class, and I'd read Dr. Seuss to the kids. And when I read, I'm jumping around. I was walking out one day, and Kate Bobillo, the preschool teacher, says, Jack, who's having more fun, you or the kids? I said, there's no contest. I said, I'd pay you to let me do this, So people say, they phrase it a little differently than you do, but it's the same question. They said, why do you write? About, and you got to understand, I'm a tough guy. All my fingers are broken from, stuff I went through and helicopter search and rescue. And then I moved out to LA, which made everything else look like a cakewalk. And I grew up in the South Side of Chicago. It's a tough neighborhood. So I'm a tough guy. But about 3 years ago, we're in one of our favorite pubs called the Stray Dog. And the owners there and the head bartender, if they've got we're in a resort village. If we get couples in from Chicago, sometimes they'll out me. They'll say, Jack to the Power Rangers, to the Care Bears. And I'm sitting at the bar with Kim, and all of a sudden there's 3 couples like your age on the other side of the bar. And they're chanting, Power Rangers, Power Rangers. They're sending me, all sorts of shots of Stoli and Fireball. And I end up arm wrestling with the guys and stuff. We became such good friends. Getting ready to walk out after a couple of hours. And this one young lady comes over to me. She says, Mr. Olesker, can I talk to you for a minute? I said, that's fine, as long as you call me Jack. I said, Mr. Olesker's up in heaven looking down. I said, I don't know. He was a tough businessman. He may be down below looking up. I said, what can I do for you? I grew up in a very dysfunctional family. My father was verbally abusive to my mother. And every week I waited for one thing. I waited for the Care Bears. And she said, I want to thank you for saving my childhood.
Oh, wow.
And I choked up, and she said, do you mind if I hug you? And I said, honey, come here. So 3 years ago, I'm at PowerCon, wonderful convention that Val Staples puts on in Los Angeles. This year it's moving to the Midwest. And this fella comes up, about 35 years old, and he's got his 4-year-old son with him. And I'm signing some mini posters for him. And he says, my son's got something for you. So I said, oh, that's great. So he reaches in his briefcase. He gives me a picture of his dad as a little boy standing next to He-Man holding his hand. And this little boy says, I want to thank you for entertaining my father when he was my age.
Oh, wow.
So, I'm so fortunate that I've had success. I've had a 40-year career, and it's brought me wonderful, wonderful things. But to light up a child's face, to light up an adult's face, of a adult who has grown up but still holds on to some of their childhood wonder and mystery, that's a joy, and that's why I write. So I hope that's my legacy, that I brought a smile to people's faces and that I entertained them. And I've still got a lot of work still to do.
Yeah, we're going to touch on that. What is upcoming for you? What can you tell us? What you're working on now? Or
oh my gosh, this is a very busy time for me. I just signed a 3-film deal called Reconciliation. Scary film. Some of my books are horror films. My mother used to say, horror books, novels. And my mother used to say, how can such a nice boy that created the Care Bears write such frightening things for adults? And I would tell her, you spend 6 years with the Care Bears, you'll want to write something scary. They're so sweet with their little Care Bear stairs and their cloud cars, So I'm doing that. Also developing 2 animated television series that unfortunately I can't talk about, but doing that as well. And we've got a great sitcom that that I'm working on now that we have in development called the Wild and Freaky Tiki Bar that is located down in New Orleans. So it's kind of like a Cajun Cheers, from my lips to God's ears. So, I'm always busy. I always have things going on. And, I just, there was there was a line in the film Patton with George C. Scott. This was the film he was born to play. And he's General Patton walking through the battlefield after a battle, and tanks are twisted, and there's smoke going up to the sky, and there's bodies all around. And he's with his aide de camp, and he looks up at the smoke rising, and he pauses for a second. You hear the cries of the wounded in the background, and he says, "I do love it so. God help me, but I do love it so. I love it more than I love my life." And if you're able to find something that you're good at and it brings you pleasure, you are blessed indeed. And that's the way I feel with all of my work, with everything I've done, and with so many wonderful avenues that I have to explore in the future.
Oh, wow. I mean, this has been a highlight for me, being able to speak to you. I mean, I've interviewed some great names over the years, and in 15 years of doing this, but yeah, it's been an absolute joy and a privilege for me. So I thank you for giving me this time. Jack, it's wonderful to speak to you, and I really could talk to you for hours. I've got one question for you, though, that's coming from one of my co-hosts relating to M.A.S.K. And he wanted to know your thoughts about them possibly joining up with the G.I. Joe world, and what you think of that.
I think it's a great idea. And frankly, I got in touch. I think it was Hasbro owns the rights on M.A.S.K.
Yeah.
I got in touch with them. And as it turns out, and this isn't any great trade secret, although I'm surprised it hasn't been bandied about more often, they are in development on a live action series. So that's happening. I'm sorry, on a live action motion picture. So that's kind of happening. I think what you're saying is absolutely right. I mean, G.I. Joe and M.A.S.K. would be a wonderful marriage. So it happens, and you never know what the future's going to hold. I mean, who would have thought 10 years ago we would see this incredible resurgence of popularity for the Motu world? And I mean, the unbelievable job that Noelle Stevenson did on She-Ra. I mean, I can't give her enough accolades, okay? And to be able to walk the line between what you want to see when there's certain pro-social issues that need to be touched upon, that are long overdue being touched upon, okay, and still maintaining the integrity of the franchise. I mean, I thought she did such an amazing job. I mean, she should be canonized in the world of animation. So for us to envision that this would happen 10 years ago, they would have said, "Are you out of your mind?" I mean, who knows what's going to be happening 10 years ago, 10 years from now. But I can tell you that I do 500 push-ups, and I do 300 stair declines, and I'm on my treadmill 3 days a week, because I want to be around to see what happens.
I want to be around and see what you do next. I'll tell you that. Absolutely. Jack, what an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for joining me. If you want to interact with Jack, you can do, of course, on heman.org. You're very active there on the new adventures on Olesker's thread. You're answering questions all the time. I mean, you're the most active person, I think, on the thread at the moment. So
that's in the vintage format, just for your listeners and viewers. It's in the vintage format on heman.org. And, as I said earlier, I got to do a shout out to heman.org. I mean, Val, what he has done with keeping the flames alive for He-Man over the many years that He-Man was in the shadows. And now you watch the Super Bowl and you see a commercial for Rocket Mortgage, and she's talking about Castle Grayskull. let me tell you something. That and the reason that the new He-Man television series are around is owed in large part to Val and his efforts for He-Man.org. I can't give him enough praise. And for me, it's a joy to be able to interact with the fans.
Couldn't agree more. Could not agree more. If just one last thing before we go, I keep trying to wrap up, but then you keep throwing something for me to kind of knock it out the park with. If Netflix or Mattel approached you now and said, "Would you come back to the He-Man franchise?" Would that be something that you would ever consider, or would you say the door now is shut and you wouldn't go back?
I wouldn't even blink. Okay, if they asked me to come back to He-Man, that would be like discovering plutonium in my backyard. Okay, I could sit down right now and write 40 pages of the series Bible. Okay. Look, the fact is there's a couple of He-Man series on the air now. I don't know if they have bad memories of He-Man, New Adventures of He-Man. I think that over time, and wonderful podcasts like you have, I think it kind of softens. But I honestly feel, and it's not just self-serving, maybe a little, but I honestly feel there's a story to be told there of opening up, and here I am, I'm starting to lay out the beat outline, opening up on Primus, and my job is done, and now I'm going back to Eternia, and Skeletor, and Flog, and Slushhead, and Critta, and a couple other characters managed to go back to, and they go back to Eternia. My God, what's happened in our absence? The world is turned upside down. The Horde has taken over. Wow, are there stories to be told there? Okay, so Mattel, if you're listening, I'm game.
Mattel, make it happen. We need this to happen. New Adventures 2023 style.
That's what I need, is something else that I'm going to fall in love with.
You like keeping busy, Jack. You said that at the beginning, so there you go. Stay on the line for me for just a second. Thank you again so much for joining us. That's it for this edition of the Retro Chat, and with this amazing man in Jack Olesker. We'll be back with more next week here at Retro Chat. Until then, signing off. See you soon. Take care.
Thank you.